We often dismiss emotional immaturity as a phase, a quirky character flaw, or simply a result of poor upbringing. But what if it's much deeper than that? What if it's a carefully constructed defense mechanism, a way to protect the psyche from wounds it doesn't yet know how to heal? According to Jungian psychology, many behaviors we label as immature are not random. They are unconscious strategies, rooted in fear, designed to shield the self from responsibility, vulnerability, and ultimately, growth. When a woman refuses to grow up emotionally, it's not always laziness or entitlement. Often, it's fear cloaked in fragility, fear of abandonment, fear of failure, fear of losing protection. And that fear runs deep. It hides beneath the tears, behind the tantrums, under the charm. It whispers, if I stay small, I'll stay safe. But safety has a price. The same defense that once protected her becomes the very prison that holds her back. Immaturity isn't just about childish behavior. It's about psychological survival. And until that survival strategy is questioned, nothing truly changes. Because healing doesn't begin where comfort lives. It begins where we dare to confront the fear beneath the mask. What if emotional maturity isn't something we simply stumble into with age, but a sacred journey, layered in symbols, shadows, and arch? Carl Jung didn't view human development as a checklist of achievements or social milestones. Instead, he believed that each person, man or woman, travels through a series of psychological transformations, each symbolic stages of evolution. 2. But here, Jung spoke of feminine archetypes such as the girl, the princess, the wife, the sorceress. The girl archetype, then comes the princess. Eventually, the immature feminine can evolve into the sorceress. And here's what's even more unsettling. Society often rewards these roles. We glorify the charm of the girl, sympathize with the demands of the princess, and romanticize the allure of the sorceress. But Jung's insight was timeless and piercing. These archetypes are not destinations. They are thresholds, temporary costumes, faces meant to be transcended, not worshipped. A woman who clings to these archetypes, consciously or not, limits her growth. She sacrifices wisdom for comfort. She postpones sovereignty for the illusion of safety. And perhaps, most painfully, she never truly meets herself. True maturity doesn't arrive when a woman gains age, titles, or social status. It arrives the moment she begins shedding the roles that once served her but now confine her. When she stops asking the world to rescue her and starts becoming the one who rescues herself. Because that's what the journey of individuation is all about. Not becoming what others expect, but becoming who you really are beneath the mask. She looks delicate, soft-spoken, wide-eyed, perhaps even endearing in her innocence. But behind the charm of vulnerability lies something much deeper and far more dangerous. A refusal to grow up. This is the girl archetype, a sigh. This archetype isn't always obvious. It often wears the mask of sweetness, playfulness, or passivity. But look closer, and a pattern emerges. An aversion to conflict, a tendency to cry instead of communicate, a habit of making others the caretakers of her emotional world. When life becomes difficult, she collapses into helplessness. When confronted, she deflects. When asked to grow, she hides behind the very fragility that once made her lovable. And society, knowingly or not, reinforces this pattern. From childhood fairy tales to romantic comedies, women are B. At her core, the girl fears one thing above all: being fully responsible for her own life. Re. But until she chooses to outgrow the safety of innocence, the girl will remain just that, a child in a woman's body, longing for a life she hasn't. Why? The princess archetype, when entitlement wears a crown. She doesn't cry like the girl. She commands, she expects, she demands. Welcome to the world of the princess archetype, a psychological mask where immaturity takes on a more assertive, even regal form. While the girl seeks protection, the princess seeks reward, without effort, without growth, without sacrifice. The princess doesn't ask for love. She believes she's owed it. She doesn't strive for success. She assumes it should be handed to her. In her world, discomfort is unfair, effort is beneath her, and disappointment is an offense. When life doesn't bend to her expectations, she erupts, not in tears, but in rage, not in sorrow, but in blame. Someone, anyone, must be responsible for her unhappiness. A man, society, her parents, fate. This archetype is seductive because it wears the illusion of strength. The princess appears confident, self-assured, even powerful. But underneath the throne is the same fragile foundation. A deep fear of responsibility and emotional maturity. She seeks control over her environment, not through inner growth, but through external manipulation, expecting the world to orbit around her needs. What makes this archetype even more dangerous is that it's glamorized in modern culture. Social media feeds are flooded with curated images of entitlement masquerading as empowerment. I deserve the best. Never settle. Treat me like royalty. But true empowerment doesn't come from what you're given. It comes from what you build. And the princess is not a builder. She's a receiver, waiting for life to serve her what she refuses to earn. The tragedy? Behind every princess is a woman who secretly fears that without the crown, without the privilege, without the admiration, she is nothing. That's why she clings so tightly to the fantasy. Because growing up would mean stepping off the pedestal, humbling herself, and confronting the part of her that still wants to be worshipped instead of loved, served instead of seen, obeyed instead of understood. Until she releases the illusion of entitlement, the princess remains emotionally stagnant, trapped in a fairy tale that never ends. Because the real story of womanhood only begins when the crown is removed. The sorceress archetype, power in the shadows, fear at the core. She, unlike the girl who seeks protection or the princess who demands adoration, the sorceress wields her immaturity with calculated precision. She, maturity, evolves into illusion, where fear cloaks itself in charisma and insecurity hides behind control. The sorceress has learned that in a world that preys on weakness, emotional chaos can be a form of dominance. So she weaponizes it. She stirs hearts, bends minds, spins webs, always pulling the strings while appearing untouched. But it's not love she seeks. It's control. Not partnership, but submission. And not connection, but power over. She is the woman who never truly lets you in. Only close enough to stay tethered, but never close enough to reach her soul. Because to be fully seen would mean exposing the fear she's buried so well. The fear of this archetype is perhaps the most deceptive, because it mimics strength while feeding off insecurity. Society, dazzled by the aesthetics of mystery, often rewards her performance. She's praised as confident, independent, seductive. But beneath the applause is a hollow echo. Because behind every game she plays lies a truth she cannot outrun. Real love requires surrender, not strategy. Real connection requires softness, not seduction. Conditioned to stay small, how society trains women to fear their own maturity. Before we blame her for not growing up, we must ask, who taught her that staying small was safer than becoming whole? Emotional immaturity in women is often misunderstood as an individual flaw, something personal, internal, and self-inflicted. But that view is incomplete. The truth is far more uncomfortable and far more systemic. Female immaturity is not simply chosen. It is inherited, conditioned, rewarded, reinforced. From the moment a girl is born, she enters a world that subtly, relentlessly teaches her that her value lies not in her depth, her strength, or her discernment, but in her sweetness, her softness, her ability to be pleasing. She is praised not for speaking her truth, but for staying quiet, not for standing her ground, but for being agreeable, not for owning her power, but for being cute, gentle, low maintenance. This conditioning is everywhere, woven into fairy tales, romantic comedies, social media, even casual compliments. She's taught that being delicate will make her lovable, that being fragile will make her desirable, that the less she demands from herself, the more she will be wanted by others. And so, emotional immaturity becomes a survival strategy, long before it ever becomes a problem. Because for centuries, women didn't have the luxury of independence. They needed protection to survive, and the surest way to receive that protection was to perform helplessness, to appear small, to embody innocence, even when they were capable of much more. Fragility became currency, submission became safety, immaturity became a role to play in exchange for belonging. But now the world has changed. The systems have shifted. Women have more freedom than ever before. But many still carry the old emotional programming. The external cages have been unlocked, but the internal ones remain. And when those old roles stop working, when helplessness no longer brings protection, when emotional dependency no longer brings love, a deep identity crisis sets in. Who am I if I'm no longer rewarded for being small? And those who dare to grow beyond this conditioning, who choose emotional responsibility over victimhood, inner strength over external validation, are often labeled cold, harsh, unfeminine, not because they've lost their essence, but because they've stepped outside the script. And a woman who cannot be controlled will always threaten a society that depends on her obedience. So the question isn't why some women remain immature. The question is, how many have ever been shown what real maturity looks like? And how many have been punished the moment they try to embody it? When immaturity stops working, the breaking point, no one talks about them. Every role eventually runs its course. Even the most carefully crafted performance of helplessness, sweetness, or seduction will, one day, begin to fail. And when it does, something quietly devastating begins to happen. A psychological crisis that few see coming. Because the truth is, emotional immaturity has an expiration date. The world, once tolerant, perhaps even indulgent, of childlike behaviors, slowly stops responding the way it used to. The attention fades, the forgiveness wears thin, the rescuers disappear, and suddenly, the woman who relied on fragility to feel safe finds herself unprepared for a reality that no longer caters to her emotional shortcuts. This is the turning point, when immaturity no longer brings protection but isolation. When relationships break under the weight of unmet responsibility. When careers stall because charm can't replace discipline. When people begin to walk away, not out of cruelty, but out of fatigue. And in that moment, A reckoning begins. Some women reflect. They awaken. They choose to grow, but many others don't. Instead, they double down, slipping deeper into blame, resentment, and victimhood. The world becomes the villain. The partner becomes the enemy. And maturity becomes a threat rather than a path forward. But what's really happening is this. A survival strategy is failing, and the psyche doesn't know what to replace it with. And unless that pain is turned inward, into reflection, ownership, transformation, it becomes outward destruction. Because when immaturity collapses, there are only two paths left: evolve or unravel. No matter how beautiful the beginning, no relationship can survive where emotional maturity is absent. Love may spark the flame, but it is maturity that keeps it burning. And when one person refuses to grow, refuses to take ownership, refuses to evolve beyond emotional dependency, the relationship slowly begins to fracture from within. You can't build a partnership with someone who still expects to be parented. You can't create trust with someone who deflects blame instead of taking responsibility. You can't cultivate intimacy with someone who uses guilt, silence, or drama as a substitute for communication. Immaturity doesn't just stunt connection, it poisons it. At first, the effects may be subtle. One partner grows tired of carrying the emotional weight. Arguments repeat in circles. Needs go unspoken or unmet. But over time, resentment settles in. One begins to feel more like a caretaker than a lover. The emotional distance widens, even if the physical closeness remains. Eventually, the bond breaks, not from lack of love, but from lack of emotional integrity. Because love without responsibility becomes a burden, and affection without growth becomes a trap. Friendships begin to sour. Careers suffer. Self-worth deteriorates. Immaturity doesn't just harm the person who carries it. It slowly corrodes everyone they try to hold on to. The tragedy? Most don't realize it until it's too late. Until the partner walks away. Until the friendship fades. Until opportunity is lost. That's when the harsh truth is finally felt. Emotional immaturity doesn't just affect how we feel. It determines what we keep, what we lose, and what we destroy. When the world stops rewarding immaturity, the birth of bitterness, there comes a moment, quiet, subtle, and devastating, when the world simply stops playing along. The charm that once worked no longer gets attention. The fragility that once drew sympathy begins to annoy. The excuses that once passed without question are met with silence. This is the moment when emotional immaturity meets reality, and reality does not flinch. For years, immaturity might have felt like a secret superpower, a way to escape responsibility, avoid accountability, manipulate outcomes. But that power was never sustainable. It was borrowed time. And when the world stops responding, many women find themselves spiraling, not into growth, but into resentment. Because when a person builds their identity around being rescued, adored, or excused, and that identity is no longer rewarded, something inside begins to break. Not transform, break. What often follows isn't self-reflection, but bitterness. A creeping sense that life has betrayed them, that others are to blame, that men are cold, friends are selfish, the world is unfair. And yet, the truth is far more sobering. The world didn't change. She simply refused to. This is the turning point that no one talks about. The crossroads where a woman must choose, evolve, or stay angry. Take ownership or weaponize resentment. Some choose awakening, but many don't. Instead, they spiral into patterns of blame, emotional warfare, and quiet hostility toward a world that no longer plays into their script. But bitterness is never liberation. It is the echo of growth avoided. Maturity is not a reward. It's a weight few are willing to carry. We romanticize growth, but rarely speak of its cost. Maturity is not a reward, it's a burden. It doesn't come wrapped in praise or comfort. It comes wrapped in responsibility, accountability, and the quiet ache of letting go of who you used to be. True maturity demands more than just age. It requires self-confrontation. It asks you to bury the fantasy that someone else will fix your life. It forces you to face the truth. No one is coming to save you, and no one owes you anything. That realization is heavy. It's the moment when blame no longer protects you, when excuses can no longer cushion you. It's the moment you become the author of your own life, and that authorship is both freeing and frightening. Because now, every choice is yours, every failure yours, every triumph yours, and many aren't ready for that weight. It's far easier to stay small than to stand tall under the gravity of your own freedom. But here's the paradox. The burden of maturity is the price of real liberation. And the question is not whether you can carry it, but whether you're willing to become strong enough to try. Immaturity is not harmless. It's a poison that spreads quietly. We often treat emotional immaturity as a harmless quirk, something inconvenient, maybe frustrating, but not dangerous. But that's a dangerous illusion. Immaturity, when left unexamined, becomes a slow-acting poison, one that seeps into every decision, every relationship, every unfulfilled dream. It's the silent force behind broken connections, sabotaged opportunities, and a deep, lingering dissatisfaction with life. Because immaturity doesn't just affect how a woman feels, it affects how she thinks, reacts, chooses, and loves. It whispers lies like, "You don't need to change. They should understand you." It convinces her that discomfort is cruelty and accountability is oppression. It feeds ego while starving growth. Over time, this internal stagnation becomes external chaos. Relationships erode, friendships turn toxic, potential is wasted. Life becomes a loop, not a journey. And worst of all, most people don't realize what's happening until the damage is irreversible. That's what makes immaturity so dangerous. It doesn't destroy everything all at once. It decays things slowly, silently, until nothing stable remains. It's not just a lack of growth. It's the slow erosion of a life that could have been whole, wise, and free. The most powerful lesson beneath all of this is simple, yet radical. Emotional maturity is a choice, one that requires courage, self-honesty, and responsibility. It's not just about growing older, but growing inward. It's about letting go of the fantasy that someone else will save you, validate you, or fix your life. Real adulthood begins the moment you stop blaming others and start asking, what part of this do I need to own? That shift, however painful, is the beginning of personal freedom. Because maturity isn't about perfection. It's about presence, accountability, and the willingness to evolve. It's about becoming someone who can be trusted with love, with life, with yourself. So the question isn't whether you've been conditioned to stay small. You have. We all have. The real question is whether you're brave enough to outgrow that conditioning. Because staying emotionally immature might feel easier, but becoming whole is what makes life worth living. And in a world that profits from your self-doubt, the boldest thing you can do is grow up and stand tall. In your truth, your power, and your responsibility.